My groin is starting to ache.
Grab onto your leg, that's an unpleasant enough thought, but if that decided not to let go and you were swimming, you'd be history.
Fascinating looking creature. Almost humanoid in some ways.
Descriptions of the kappa vary.
Rod's jammed in. This is physical stuff. Physical work.
And I can see its gullet opening and closing. If I was so inclined, I could put my fist down there quite easily.
It's actually believed that if you kill fish, that's going to bring bad luck to you.
It all started long before anyone outside the crew had a clue, back when River Monsters was still pulling in huge audiences, and Jeremy Wade was the face everyone associated with danger, mystery, and the kind of fish that looked like they could swallow you whole. And while the cameras were rolling, the energy was electric, the fans were obsessed, and the adventures were legit. Behind the scenes, the reality was way less glamorous because the expeditions were brutal, the heat was punishing, the locations were so remote you could lose a crew member in the jungle and not find them until morning, and that happened more than once. And yet, Jeremy kept going because he had this mental list, this impossible dream of tracking down the most legendary freshwater monsters known to folklore and science. From the massive arapaima to catfish the size of small cars to the Goliath tigerfish that had haunted him for years until he finally caught one in season 2, but while the audience thought it was. All just part of the adventure. There was something else brewing, something that would end up becoming Jeremy Wade's scandal and change the course of his career for good. The thing is, Jeremy had always been a perfectionist, obsessed with accuracy, conservation, and making sure every episode stayed true to the mystery, and he refused to fake anything for the cameras, which meant sometimes the crew went home empty-handed, no matter how much money that day's filming had cost. And while that integrity made River Monsters a hit with fans who trusted him, it didn't sit so well with certain people on the production side, who wanted more drama, more staged wow moments, and less of the slow, exhausting, real-life detective work that Jeremy insisted on. And one of those people happened to be a key crew member named Dan, a field producer who'd been with the show since its early days and had quietly started compiling his own footage, notes, and expedition plans, supposedly for backup purposes. But in reality, he was building his own spin-off concept, one that leaned heavily on Jeremy's personal research and the network's funding. Jeremy found out the hard way in 2016, just before filming what would become the final season, when an email chain meant for a TV exec accidentally got forwarded to him. And in it, Dan pitched a series that was basically River Monsters without Jeremy Wade. And worse, the pitch used expedition locations that Jeremy hadn't even filmed yet, meaning Dan was not only poaching his ideas, but also tipping off outsiders to sites that took years of groundwork to secure. That email lit the fuse, and suddenly the tight-knit, all-for-one vibe of the crew shattered, with Jeremy confronting Dan in a meeting that everyone who was there still swears felt like a courtroom cross-examination, because Jeremy came in with printed pages, dates, maps, and a calm but lethal tone that left no doubt this was going to get ugly. And it did, because Dan didn't back down. Instead, accusing Jeremy of locking crew members out of creative credit, keeping expedition intel secret, to control the show's direction, and pushing the team into dangerous conditions without proper safety protocols. That's where the legal side kicked in, because suddenly lawyers were involved on both ends, contracts were being dissected, and the disputes spilled into claims over intellectual property, environmental permits, and whether certain expeditions had skirted local regulations to get the kind of once-in-a-lifetime shots the audience loved. Jeremy Wade's latest news at that point was all about the upcoming grand finale season, but behind closed doors, the real story was the mounting tension, the meetings where lawyers sat in the back scribbling notes while Jeremy tried to keep filming on schedule, and the growing realization that if this dragged on, River Monsters might not survive intact. The irony was that Jeremy had already been thinking about ending the show for completely different reasons. He'd nearly ticked off every species on his mental list, and he didn't want to start chasing made-up myths just to keep cameras rolling. But now the scandal added a layer of urgency, because he wasn't about to hand the show over to someone who had, in his view, betrayed him and endangered the very premise of the series. Still, the work went on. And if you watched that final season knowing what was happening in the background, You can spot the moments where Jeremy looks just a little more drained than usual, where the treks seem to weigh heavier, because on top of the malaria scares, the infections, the endless travel, and the bone-deep exhaustion, he was now balancing host biologist and expedition leader with the role of a man fending off a takeover attempt in real time, and that's what makes Jeremy Wade's Scandal so wild. It wasn't just about a fight over a TV show, it was about trust, about the very thing that made River Monsters worth watching in the first place being threatened from within. The breaking point came halfway through that last filming cycle, deep in a politically unstable region where the team had to hike for 3 days just to reach a river system rumored to hide one of the last unconfirmed species on Jeremy's list, and tempers were already short from the heat, the bugs, and the constant need to keep equipment dry in a place where the air itself felt like soup when a piece of critical sonar gear went missing. And Jeremy's first thought wasn't theft, it was just another jungle mishap. But then he found out that Dan had quietly arranged for a separate crew to meet them downstream to collect supplemental footage for his own project. And that gear had somehow ended up with them instead, meaning Jeremy's team spent 2 extra days in brutal conditions without the tools they needed, while Dan's people filmed a suspiciously similar sequence elsewhere. That was it. Jeremy called in the network, halted filming for the first time in the show's history, and demanded an immediate resolution, which spiraled into emergency negotiations on satellite phones while the rest of the crew tried to keep camp running. And by the end of that week, Dan was officially removed from the production, escorted out by security once they made it back to a base camp with vehicle access. But the damage was already done. Jeremy Wade's latest news was about to shift from triumph to turmoil, because Dan hit back hard, filing a lawsuit alleging unsafe working conditions, misuse of expedition data, and breach of contract. And while Jeremy's legal team countered with claims of intellectual property theft and sabotage, the whole thing became a grind of depositions, evidence requests, and endless back and forth that bled right into the final wrap of River Monsters. Jeremy made the call to end the show publicly on the high note of having completed his impossibly ambitious species list, but privately it was clear the scandal had accelerated the decision, because even if the network wanted more seasons, Jeremy wasn't willing to risk another betrayal or see the core of the show diluted. That's why he refused any spin-offs or reboots, even when the network floated ideas of passing the torch to a new host. He saw it as protecting the integrity of what they built, and he wasn't about to watch someone else take the name River Monsters and turn it into cheap reality TV. The fallout didn't just end with the series' wrap. The legal case dragged on for months after the cameras stopped. And though the court filings were sealed, the final resolution left Dan out of the industry entirely, while Jeremy quietly moved on, carrying the weight of years spent in extreme conditions, balancing conservation goals with the realities of making compelling television, and the knowledge that not everyone he'd brought into his inner circle had his back. What makes Jeremy Wade's scandal still resonate today is how it ties into the bigger picture. Here was a guy who'd built his career on demystifying fearsome creatures, turning monsters into misunderstood marvels, yet the real danger turned out to be much closer to home. And yet, in true Jeremy fashion, he didn't vanish. Instead, he pivoted into mighty rivers and mysteries of the deep, widening his scope to tackle threats to river health, climate impacts, and oceanic mysteries, still with that mix of detective work and deep respect for the natural world, but now with even tighter control over his teams and production methods. He took the lessons from the scandal, about trust, about guarding the mission, and baked them into everything he did next, so there would be no repeat of what happened on those final River Monsters expeditions. Jeremy Wade's latest news in recent years has been less about drama and more about purpose, but the shadow of Jeremy Wade's scandal is never far from the conversation among those who followed the show closely, because it marked the moment when a dream project that had pushed the limits of adventure television also revealed just how fragile even the strongest-looking teams can be. And maybe that's the part worth talking about. When you think of Jeremy Wade now, do you remember the man waist-deep in murky water hauling out a thrashing river giant? Or do you think about the battles no one saw on screen, the ones fought in conference rooms and courtrooms, where the stakes weren't just the catch of the day, but the very soul of the show?